So, thank you for coming, everyone. Hope you're having a good IT forum so far. My name's Alex Balkenpool. I'm a product manager on the terminal services team. I'm in the terminal services, the SoftGrid for terminal services product. And today we're going to talk a little bit about SoftGrid, terminal services, and the relationship between the two. In terms of prerequisites, I'm not going to make any assumptions about you as the audience today. So this might be a little higher than some of the sessions that you're used to. We have some more detailed sessions this week that you can go to get more information. So, before I begin, how many of you know what terminal services is? That's always a good sign to see. How many of you know what SoftGrid application virtualization is? Oh, okay, we can all go home. No. And how many of you really think you understand the difference between the two? Okay, that's what I thought. So that's what we're going to try and leave with today is a real understanding of what's the difference between SoftGrid and terminal services. In terms of the technical detail sessions, there's the three at the bottom that you see there, which is the SRV202, which is tomorrow. That's a deeper drill on the terminal services. You'll see some of the same demos that you see here. We have the client session. Unfortunately, that happened earlier in the week, but obviously it's archived, so you can get more detail on the SoftGrid. And we also have a SoftGrid, SRV202 IS is a SoftGrid and terminal services Q&A, and we have two of those this week. So if you want to come and ask additional questions that you couldn't get answered here, we'll make sure that we answer them in that session, in one of those two sessions for you. Let's skip the agenda. So there's kind of a big myth out there, which is, and I've put one version of it up on here, which is TS and SoftGrid can't be used together, or TS and SoftGrid do the same thing, or what is this TS and SoftGrid? And so we're going to show you how you can use SoftGrid for terminal services and SoftGrid for the desktop to make it easy to roam applications between multiple devices. So it doesn't matter if the user's going to log onto a desktop or onto a terminal server. We'll talk about the differences between SoftGrid and terminal services and how you should think about it in your organizations, how you choose the technology and when each is most appropriate. In terms of the picture that you see here on the right-hand side, you see an application represented by the orange and white balls, or the orange line with the white balls, which shows an application being streamed both to the desktop and to the terminal server with an alternate channel of using RDP to actually deliver the application via terminal services. And we'll talk about why you might want to do an architecture like this. Because the first time a lot of people see this picture, they can find it very confusing. So hopefully by the end, you'll be not confused. Just quickly wanted to show you this. You've probably seen this slide in many sessions this week. Both application virtualization and presentation virtualization, so that's SoftGrid and terminal services, are key parts of our virtualization strategy. And they allow us to round out with a set of different technologies. Don't want to spend any time on this. It's kind of marketing stuff, and you guys have seen it. So for those of you who are not quite sure why you should be using TS, but I think most of you do, so I'm going to skip through this. These are the sorts of things we see customers doing with terminal services. So the one I really want to talk about here is the one at the top, data security and compliance. Increasingly, we're seeing people using terminal services, not for remote access or line of business application deployment, which is the traditional sort of uses of terminal services, but as a way of keeping the application and data in the center. So, for example, you may see articles in the news where somebody's laptop gets stolen and it has umpteen credit card numbers on or social security numbers, and personal information's getting lost. If the data's never there on the endpoint, it's away in a data center on a terminal server, you get the real advantage of there's very little opportunity for either the user, and sometimes the users are malicious, or a malicious application actually on the endpoint from stealing that data. The worst that can happen is you steal what's outputted to the screen, but you can't run off with a 2 or 3 gigabyte database. The other advantages terminal services has is some of you may be using SSL VPN products that have attachment wipers or secure desktop products where you isolate the application that you're running locally, like a web application. They're great for when the system's absolutely trusted. The problem with any sort of software solution is if the data's coming down to the machine and you're processing the data locally, if there's a malicious application, it can get the data. If your antivirus doesn't spot it or your malware doesn't spot it, or if the user's malicious. A sandboxing approach is never going to stop that security attack vector. So terminal services has that unique place to play in the security world. The other one that we see is branch, which is the third one down there. Branch is becoming increasingly important. Lots of you may have branches that you're looking after where you'll have application servers actually out at the branch, and you've got to have some sort of IT support. Often don't have IT support at a branch, obviously. So what you do is you take those application branch servers, the IIS servers, the SQL servers, move them back into the data center, consolidate those servers. You get advantages by doing that. You have less SQL instances, less IIS instances. You can use better boxes. You can have redundancy. Then you have the problem of, well, you've got to get the app, still run the application in an efficient manner over the wire. And some applications, even HTML applications, are quite bandwidth unfriendly. Just because something's written with HTML or Java or Ajax doesn't mean it isn't very chatty on the wire. So again, by running that application in the data center close to the data and just remoting the user interface to the local branch, you can get a better user experience, use less network bandwidth, and not have hardware out at the branches that you don't want. So make your job a lot easier in terms of the amount of infrastructure that you have to manage. So there might be some of you in the audience just wondering, so presentation virtualization, isn't this just terminal services? Isn't this just terminal services camping on the virtualization name? The answer to that is yes. We are just camping on the name to some respects. But it is virtualization. It's always been virtualization. So you've got to think about virtualization in the broader sense of the word, not just sort of the virtual servers that you've seen to date. Virtualization is any abstraction of the system, whether you're abstracting with virtual server, the operating system from the hardware, whether with SoftGrid, you're abstracting the application from the operating system. With terminal services, we're abstracting the execution of the application from the place where it's displayed or presented. So in that context, anytime you have an abstraction that's giving you an abstraction you wouldn't have normally had in sort of a desktop system, you've got a form of virtualization. So presentation virtualization is absolutely a virtualization technology. It may be a non-traditional use of the term, but I think as we go forward and see the types of virtualization technologies on the market proliferating, you're going to see lots and lots of more types of virtualization technologies. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on and talk a bit about Windows Server 2008. I'm going to do this relatively quickly, show you some demos, and then we're going to move on and talk about SoftGrid. And then we're going to wrap it all back up and talk about how SoftGrid benefits TS. So I just want to set that expectation of where the presentation's going. So in terminal services, in Windows Server 2008, we focused on two areas. The first area is our platform features. So the platform features are those things that are inherent to the system. The reliability of the system, the security of the system. And we did several things. One of the things on here at the top, which is quite important, is refactored TS core. That's a bit of a euphemism for doing a lot of rewriting of code, which is a good thing. What we did is we went back and we looked at terminal services, which we've had for a long time in the system, and said, what are the sort of attacks we expect people to do on terminal services in the next 5 or 6 years? How can we design that attack vector out? Where do people struggle with the patching of the system, and how can we improve that? And generally, how can we make the system more reliable? So I gave you some concrete examples. So we have something that manages the sessions, so who can log on and who's logged on at the same time. And we have something that manages the RDP connections. Why is that important? Well, that session manager I was just mentioning is also used for fast user switching on Vista. So you don't want to be in a scenario where just because you're using fast user switching that you have to have the RDP stack up and running. Now, pre-Vista and pre-Windows 2008, that was the scenario you were in. To be able to use fast user switching, you had to have all of RDP running in the background. Now we have two separate services. This means you don't have to have them running at the same time. It also means that if you want to patch the terminal services service, you can do that without bringing the rest of the box down. So you get extra reliability and easier patching. We've also improved our WMI interfaces. So I want to ask the audience this, because we debate this endlessly. So how many of you use WMI scripting or plan on using PowerShell and WMI scripting to manage your system? Only a few of you. Okay, that's interesting. Well, so everything we do in the MMC, in the new terminal services, almost everything, not everything, is done using WMI calls. So anything you can do in the shell or in the administrative tools, you can do with WMI. Now, WMI can be a little arcane and a little complex. PowerShell makes that a lot easier. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in scripting and automating installation and management, that you make sure you attend any of the PowerShell sessions that are happening. We also make sure that the platform's good for our partners like Citrix and many of the others to build on top of. So, a lot of our customers use value-added products to take terminal services to a broader set of customer scenarios. Improve the experience features, scale up into the top of the enterprise range. So we want to make sure we had a really solid foundation. The other thing we've done, we've introduced several new features, and we're going to talk about these in a little more detail, but I'll just briefly outline them. We've got Terminal Services Remote App. This is our version of Seamless Windows, so the ability to deliver a single application and integrate it on the local desktop so it looks and feels like it's running locally. Gateway, which is a way of encapsulating RDP in HTTPS so you can route it easily across the internet. Our TS Web Access site, which makes it easy to launch applications. And TS Easy Print. TS Easy Print is a print subsystem designed so you don't no longer have to install print drivers on the terminal server. And we're going to talk about each of these. And the one that's missing under the bottom there for some reason is the terminal server session broker, and we'll talk about that. So, as I mentioned, remote programs, they run on the terminal server and they integrate locally. And the one thing that we've done with Remote App is we've made sure that we've integrated it with the system tray and that it looks and feels like it's running locally. I'm going to show that in a demo. TS Web Access. You're going to see this page in the demo. I want to say some things now, though, about it before we do the demo. So the TS Web Access page is a single portal designed for a single server. So, we can have one web access page per server. That's one option. What we can also do is if you have identically configured terminal servers, you can use this web page to point to a farm of terminal servers. But they all have to be identically configured, and I mean identically configured. Same applications, the same operating system revision. So if it's 2008, they all have to be 2008. If it's 32-bit, it all has to be 32-bit. And you can then have a load balanced cluster. If you have, there's no personalization, so we make the assumption that all apps on that farm are available to all users. So if you're looking for something more complex, you'll need to look at a third-party value to really get the sort of differentiation in terms of users and personalization in terms of users. The infrastructure elements are a web part and an ActiveX control, so you can use this to create your own solutions if you want as well. Some people get confused about when TS should be used in place of a VPN because it's doing terminal services over HTTPS. The real key is you don't want to use it in place of a VPN. If you need broad network access, so you need multiple protocols, then you probably want a VPN of some sort, probably an SSL VPN. But if you want to provide just access to resources using terminal services, you want an easy way to route that across the internet so people can come from home or perhaps partner sites or customer sites, then this is absolutely an ideal solution. You also use it in conjunction with VPN products to give the terminal server administrator additional control over who can access which terminal server resource. And it allows access not just to terminal servers, but things running XP desktops, Vista desktop as well. So I just want to talk briefly about the way that it works because I want to really highlight the difference here between TS Web Access and TS Gateway. All TS Web Access is a place to go and find your information. So you connect to the web access site and it sends the connection information back to the client. At that point, we stop using the web access. It's no longer used after that. The user automatically will then create a connection to the terminal server gateway. Gateway does have to be domain joined. I know some people are nervous of putting domain joined machines in the DMZ. We're not. We think you can absolutely put this as a domain joined in the DMZ as long as you have an adequate firewall in front of it. If you are nervous about putting this in a DMZ, you can move it behind the internal firewall. and then you can use an SSL terminator, something like ISA to provide the SSL termination in the DMZ. The reason this has to be domain joined, and this is where the important element is what we actually use Active Directory, and we use the new network policy server, used to be called IAS, to do querying on who can connect to the terminal server resources. So we check, one, can they come through the gateway? And then two, are they allowed to send packets to the terminal server? If we say yes, then they can then access through the gateway and make their connection. We don't determine whether they can actually log on to the terminal server or the desktop. That's still done by the security policy on the endpoint. So this just determines who can connect to what and when. Something went funny with those. So I wasn't planning to spend some time on this, but I think I will do, actually. So we've got a whole bunch, and there's a typo there. I should say Windows Server 2008 at the top of the slide. So bad on me, that one. We've got a whole bunch of new features. So I'm going to give you plenty of time to read this. I'm not going to take the slide away because I can see that everybody's reading it. In terms of the experience, I'd probably pick out a couple here. We now have the ability to do custom resolutions. We can do 4096 by 2048. That can support very large monitors. It also enables us to do what we call monitor spanning. Monitor spanning allows you to have multi-monitors with a remote desktop session. To be clear, the terminal server only knows that we have a single desktop, so it gets spanned across the two monitors. So you have to have your monitors lay out, as you're looking at it, 1 and 2. So they have to be next to each other. But this does allow you to take advantage of the extra real estate that you have if you have a multi-monitor. It isn't true multi-monitor. If you maximize, if you've got a full desktop session to a terminal server, if you maximize the session, and then it maximizes across both monitors, the application. However, if you're using Terminal Services Remote App, we do obey the window controls, and there we make sure that it just maximizes to the monitor. So this feature really comes into its own when you're using TS Remote App. We also have 32-bit color. The 32-bit color, this is non-intuitive, by the way, so it's quite important. The 32-bit color actually has a better compression than our 24-bit color mode. And that's because of the way 32-bit color works. So if you're using 24-bit color on a terminal server, you probably want to up it to 32, so you get bandwidth improvements on applications that are sort of very rich, so things like PowerPoint, Internet Explorer. We also have a group policy that allows you to switch to an alternate RDP algorithm. Fortunately, I don't have a demonstration of that. That just come in very late in RC0. That will halve the bandwidth that we think on a typical connection. This is initial testing, so we've still got more testing before we do the white paper to formalize that. But on a sort of average server mix where you're using Word, Outlook, Internet Explorer, we're seeing gains of sort of halving the traffic. There is a cost to that. And this is why you have to enable it with a group policy. It does require 8 megabytes of memory per user on the server. This is probably something that's great for on a 64-bit terminal server, but probably isn't something that you would want to run on a 32-bit terminal server if you're trying to eke out as many users as possible out of that server. In terms of security, we have NAP integration for the terminal server gateway, so we can make sure that a client endpoint is healthy. And we have a new network authentication. This is really quite important. What we do today is we ask you for what we do traditionally with Windows 2003 is you would connect to the terminal server and you'd see the logon screen on the terminal server, put your details in and log on. The problem there is twofold. First of all, you've connected to the terminal server, so you've spun up resources on the terminal server. That gives a potential attack vector. And it also uses resources. So there are some theoretical attacks there in terms of spinning up resources and not consuming and not using them. And so what we did is we introduced the new network level authentication. What this does is it forces the authentication to happen before we spin the session up. So you get prompted for the password at the local machine. We authenticate at the network level. Once that's successful, we then spin up to the higher level. Spin up the session. We also have their per session and direct attached device isolation. Traditionally, if you were an administrator and you went onto a terminal server, you looked in the list of devices that were attached from the local machine, you could see all of them. What we've done is we've put additional security mechanisms in to ensure that a device is truly isolated within a user's session and there's no way to share it between sessions. It's quite an important improvement, especially for printers. In terms of manageability, I've covered a lot of the manageability earlier. I think the only thing I'd really like to highlight here is the full IPv6 support. So terminal services gateway, all of the component licensing server, everything that we have in terms of the components, fully IPv6 enabled and IPv6 ready. So you run this solution over an IPv6 network with no problem whatsoever. I think the one I would really like to address on the platform is profile corruption. So can I get a show of hands? How many of you have profile corruption problems on your terminal servers? Okay, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. How many, put your hands down if you know about UPH Clean. Okay, so most of you do. That's good. I wanted to check that people knew about it. UPH Clean is a service that we shipped for both Vista and for terminal services. Sorry, for XP and for Windows Server 2003, which helps address some of the profile corruption issues, which are caused by having profile open on multiple machines and not being able to unload it properly. Many of the benefits of UPH Clean are now built into both Vista, so you get them on the desktop, which is great, but more importantly, they're also built into Windows Server. So on terminal services, you should find that roaming profiles are more reliable. And when you couple that with folder redirection, that you can do more advanced folder redirection with both Vista and with Windows Server 2008, you can reduce the amount of data in the user profiles and make them more reliable. We're also going to show you today how you can use SoftGrid to help do that. So I'm going to give you a demo. So it helps if I press the buttons, of course. That's good. So what I have here is I have a Vista SP1 machine, and I have a virtual machine that I'm running on it. The virtual machine is a terminal server. It's a domain controller. It's kind of everything for my infrastructure. Don't have to run them all on one server. They will work quite happily on separate servers. So I'm going to connect to the server, and I'm just going to show you some of the new administration elements that we've got, because I want to show you how easy. This, for this demo, it's all pre-configured. We'll go through a lot of the configuration steps in the more detailed session. So here I have my server, and I'm going to bring up Server Manager. Server Manager is the one place we have in Windows Server 2008 for managing all of the different roles. Gives you a quick and simple place to see a summary of the roles that are installed and how they're configured. So, and this all uses, remember I was talking about WMI earlier? Server Manager uses WMI to collect a lot of this information. So that's just coming up. I'm going to the Terminal Services role. And what I'm going to show you is the new snap-ins that we've got for managing the new features. It's taking a little time to load the WMI data. So one of the reasons this is a little slower than I'd like is I am running this all on one machine. So here's the Server Manager. Shows me a bunch of information relevant to the terminal server role. It shows me whether my services are started. Shows me whether there's any important events I need to be aware of. Our Remote App Manager is where we manage which applications we want to make available. So we have all the settings that we want to customize the remote app. These allow us to set things like the gateway settings, what color depth the application is going to be in. But what I want to really show you today is, so this is the list of remote apps. So you can see I've already got a whole bunch added, so I'm going to add a new one. And I can do it with either the action pane here, or I can right-click and do Add Program. What it's doing at this point is going off and querying the Start menu. It's looking for the applications that have Start menu items. If there isn't a Start menu item, then what happens, it will allow me to go to Browse, and I can browse for any application that I want. So I think I'm going to add Calculator in, because I think it's about the only application that I haven't added. Gives me a preference. It says that it's going to be available through TS Web Access. That's automatic. And it tells me that it's going to allow command line arguments are set to no. The reason we do this is to stop users passing command line arguments when they open the application. It's a manageability and a slight security feature. It also stops users running malicious RDP files that might have command lines they're not aware of. So what that's done is that's added calculator to the list, and the list is alphabetical. And at this point, I could go off and create an RDP file and give that to my users to connect, or I could create a Windows installer package. In fact, if you do our instructor-led lab that we have later in the week that I'll be doing, or you go and use the hands-on lab, you'll actually go through creating the installer package. Just a note for you, if you're planning to do the instructor-led lab or the whole, you probably don't want to do both of them. The instructor-led lab that we're going to do is the whole, but I'll be walking through the instructor-led lab, and I will also be showing you some other tips and tricks. So you probably want to pick which one you want to do. I just don't want you to come to both of them and be unhappy. So we've added in that. I've already got my gateway configured. Again, we'll configure it more deeply in the more detailed session. And I've set some connection authorization policies, say who can connect to the terminal server gateway, and I've set some resource authorization policies. So what are they allowed to connect to in terms of terminal servers? For me, I kind of cheated and said allow them to access everything. You don't need to do that. You can be quite granular here, but I always cheat in my demos. So what does this actually look like from a user perspective? So I'm going to minimize that and bring up Internet Explorer. So stop that. So I get an authentication prompt and log on as a user, not as the administrator. And I can save this credential if I want to, but I'm not going to for the purposes of the demo. And that logs on to the TS web page. It looks at all of the apps, and there's the calculator that I just added. We also have a remote desktop tab. This allows people to specify an individual server or an individual machine that they want to connect to in remote desktop mode. So both of those are configurable from here, or sorry, accessible from here. So for the remote app, let's start Outlook. So being an IE app, we have to prompt. All of these prompts do have a don't ask me again. To get these, there are a couple of important things. We have a feature called RDP file signing, where you sign the RDP connection using an SSL certificate. If you want to reduce the number of prompts and make sure that users can have this option to say, don't ask me again, you do need to sign the RDP files. And that gives us the maximum security and the maximum trust. You can just use an SSL certificate for that. So I'll put the password in. So one thing I want to show you is, although I didn't show you setting up gateway today, you'll see that I am going to use the gateway. The credentials look like, so I'll start again. Whilst these are the same machine, this feature of using the credentials, taking them once and using them for the gateway and for the terminal server does work with multiple machines. It's just an option that needs to be set. So that, again, helps reduce the authentication prompts. The reason I'm talking a lot about authentication prompts is any of you that have played with some of the earlier betas or perhaps read our TS blog will know that some customers were quite unhappy about the number of prompts that we had in earlier betas. We've done a lot of work to reduce those prompts. So what's happening is the remote app is going off to the gateway. It's authenticating with the gateway, checking can I use the gateway and am I allowed to access the terminal server. Once that's done, it starts logging onto the terminal server, logs onto the session, and then displays the application once the session is started. So here you can see we're starting up Outlook. I don't have any mail in here, but the important thing here is the application looks and feels like it's running locally. It's integrated properly with the desktop. You see down here, we've actually got the system tray icon for Outlook on the system tray. You see that it's the remote Outlook because it says remote afterwards. I also have Excel running here, which was another app I already had running in my session. So I already reconnected to the session. So the Excel is also running. You see they're not bounded, they look and feel. I can cut and paste between them. I also tell that they're remote from the Smart Preview, we put the word remote, but we try and treat them like a first-class citizen. So we make sure that the app will work with things like Flip 3D, so everything that the user expects to get with a local application works with their remote application. We're trying to remove as much confusion from the user's perspective as to whether the application is remote or not. So that's the terminal services demo. I'm going to move on now. Yep, got the right thing. So we're going to talk about SoftGrid. So there's two types of SoftGrid, and this is the first thing that some people find confusing, is we have SoftGrid for the desktop, that's one product, and we have SoftGrid for terminal services. And that's another product. SoftGrid for the desktop comes as part of the Microsoft Desktop Optimization Pack, which is a great set of features which you can buy if you're a software assurance customer. That allows you to manage group policy, collect error reports, and basically reduce the management cost of the Windows platform. And SoftGrid is very much part of that for the desktop. For terminal server customers, so for people who want the same SoftGrid benefits they get on the desktop that they want on their terminal server in managing applications, you need to buy an additional CAL, which is the SoftGrid Application Virtualization CAL for TS. And I think that's nearly the longest name of a product in Microsoft. It's not quite the longest, but nearly. And the key difference is one runs on the desktop and one runs on the terminal server. If you remember nothing else from the session, if you remember that key point, that SoftGrid for the desktop runs on the desktop and SoftGrid for terminal server runs on terminal server, as you come to think about SoftGrid down the line, you'll find that it becomes clear to separate and clear to understand. So what are those benefits? Oh, I forgot I had this slide. So what is SoftGrid? Well, SoftGrid allows us to deliver an application, a virtual application. And what do we mean by a virtual application? So the first element is application isolation, and this is the real part of the virtualization, that abstraction I was talking about earlier. And what the application isolation allows us to do, it allows us to package an application up into a file format that can be easily distributed. And when we package that application and watch that application, we package all the binaries and all the calls that are needed to run the application into a single entity. And when that's delivered to the endpoint, we run it inside a sandbox. And what we make sure is that that application is isolated from other applications and isolated from the operating system, and we'll explain that in a minute. The packaging process, by the way, is really not that much harder than sort of snapshot MSI repackaging. I'm interested, how many of you do MSI repackaging? So you take somebody else's application and put it into your own MSI. Okay, it's a reasonable number of you. So if you know, for you guys, if you've done that, this is easier, much easier. Then have a central management infrastructure. So this is the SoftGrid server, and with SoftGrid 4.5 it will be our interactions with SMS. So we'll have a coherent management system to be able to help you deliver the virtual applications that we've packaged up into the isolation format and deliver them out to individual desktops and individual users. And then we have on-demand delivery. So one way to deliver the application can be using SMS. The other is what's called application streaming. And what we do there is we deliver the bits as we need them to the desktop. So how does that work? So the on-demand delivery, it's permissions-based, so we only send the applications to the users who are supposed to have them. We determine that using groups, and we publish an icon, so like an Excel icon, to the desktop. When the user clicks on the, all they have is the icon. So they'll get the icon, and when they click on the icon, what happens is we start to send elements. So the very first thing we'll send is the icon, and then we'll stop. So that's the state here. Then when they double click on the icon, we start to send out components. So we start sending out DLL files, exe files, resource files, data files, and we start streaming them down into the sandbox environment. So you can see here, as the streaming happens, it starts to fill up. The really key here is we only send what's needed. So if you only need, so for example, Office is a very large package. Word's a very large package. Most people don't use all of the features of Word. So with SoftGrid, what happens is we stream all of those files that are needed to run Word, and then when anybody needs anything else, so perhaps they invoke a function in Word they've never used before, we pull what's needed from the SoftGrid server. The key here is we're always pulling the files locally. So if we're a desktop, we're pulling the files from the soft, or the bits of files that we need from the SoftGrid server, we're pulling down to the local desktop. Personally, I like to think of it as kind of like a file copy on steroids. It brings down just what you need, and then it starts to run the application on the local machine. Now, that local machine could be a desktop, or it could be a terminal server. So if you think about the isolation that we're getting here, the streaming process, we can stream to the desktop or stream to the server. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. The key is it's always locally executed, and it's always cached for performance. So we cache the files. So if somebody goes offline, as long as they don't want to do anything additional that they haven't done before with the application, they can continue working on a desktop. Now, and you can choose to cache the whole set of applications down to a single workstation. So the isolation, why do we do it? Well, we do it, there's obviously the ease of making sure that the application isn't tattooing the registry and isn't tattooing the operating system, which is extremely important. It also helps us improve application compatibility, and this is all part and parcel of the same thing. So we virtualize the application per instance. So if you look on the right hand, by the way, when we say virtualize, you can see some of the things there that we virtualize. It's system files, fonts, registry keys, services, semaphores, mutexes, a lot of the real guts of the system. So we're tracking at a quite detailed solution. And SoftGrid is the only solution on the market that does all of these things. So if you look on the right-hand side at a standard application install, what you see, let's see if I can do this without killing myself. We have two applications running side by side, and they both read and write data, and they both write to configuration files, and they have shared files. The problem is when you've got two applications doing that, they kind of fight over the files, and some of you will have seen this, where one application writes to one file and then it writes to another file. And whilst it's doing that, either at best, they're just fighting over a simple setting that's not really going to matter to the user. At worst, one application breaks the other application. So when we have a virtual environment, what we do, let's see if I can do this without killing my ears again, is what we do is we take the application, we allow it to read-write the data still, and that's important because you need the application to be able to save documents into the My Documents folder, things like that. And we still allow calls out to the system services and to configuration, but for things that are, and we do this based on looking at the application, we trap a whole bunch of the calls as read-only. And so whilst we allow some read-write out, we also making sure that we also happen to have a whole bunch of read-write elements happening within the environment. So if there's something that is exclusive to the application and unique to the application, rather than writing it to the real file system, we write it to a shadow file system that the application is monitoring and looking at. The advantage of this is it means the application never tattoos the registry. It means the application never replaces a system file that it shouldn't replace. And more importantly, if you have two applications running side by side, literally one application doesn't know the other application's running. They all have their private file space, their private namespace, their private registry space, so they can't conflict and they can't affect each other. And this is extremely powerful both for app-to-app compatibility and also in terms of keeping the operating system stable from the respective applications just going and overwriting things that they shouldn't. So when we have two applications, what you can see is they can still have shared access to those services in the middle. Reason we need to do that is you do want to do things like cut and paste between two applications. Remember I said one application doesn't know about the other. We obviously have to have some holes to make sure the user can still work. But because they all have their own private data set and their own private configuration set, again, they just won't conflict. And the key is they always process locally. So how does this help from a workload? So especially for those of you that are in the room that package into MSIs, you'll probably recognize this process. Let's see if I can use the mouse instead. No, I can't. if I use the pointer. So this is a typical software distribution process. Even if you don't have a formal process in your organization, you're probably doing most of these things. So for most people, what they do is, especially in our larger customers, is they'll install on a test computer, and you need to test it against all the other apps you have on your standard image set. So I'm sure many of you have a standard image. And you need to resolve conflicts. Once you've resolved those conflicts, you might have a package you can finally package up and use as your base application package. Key to notice is all of these processes are iterative and take time. Once you've done that, you've got to pass it to the QA and test. So it needs to actually be you need to actually test it with some real users. You've tested it in the lab. So you start to push them out with a deployment mechanism. And my eyes are beginning to fail me at this distance. So you'll distribute it out, and you'll take it through to the endpoint. The problem is once an application gets to the endpoint, it can break it, or it can break another application. And sometimes it'll only break it for part of the user community. So you might not detect it through this process. The problem you get is that if you suddenly start getting help desk calls because you've started deploying an application Y starts breaking application X, or worse still, application Y starts causing an operating system issue, not only do you have to fix the machines that you just broke, which is a big process, you have to go back to the end of this process and start all over again. And I'm sure many of you will have found you're caught into this endless cycle of testing applications and how do I get them out. Some customers get around this by just telling their users they can't have any new applications, but it isn't a particularly practical solution. So what does this look like with SoftGrid? So as you can see, SoftGrid kind of makes it slightly shorter. It also does one other key thing that I'll get to in a moment. So you sequence the application, and sequencing is a packaging process. It's fairly simple to run. You have a special machine called a sequencer, and we have sessions on the sequencer at this event. And what you do is you turn the sequencer on, you install the application, it monitors the application during install, captures everything you need, and then you have your sequence package. Again, some of you may have tried that with MSI repackaging and found it quite difficult. Sequencing is a tad easier. You need to do a functional test. You still need to test that the application works and all of the bits of the application work that you sequenced and that you sequenced correctly. But you no longer have to test it against every other application on the system. And you no longer have to worry about it breaking the operating system. And the reason for that is, you remember I said every application writes to its own private space, so it has its own private file system and its own private registry. Well, the advantage of that is if we remove the application from the system, it is like it was never there. So the operating system never knew it was there. The advantage to that is, you know what, is even if you fail these points, is once you get it to the endpoint, you can't break it. You can't break the endpoint by deploying a SoftGrid application. So suddenly, not only is this a simpler process, it's a much lower risk process. So you can push out the applications, and I'm sure you'll all be completely professional, but you might not need to take quite as much due diligence at these early stages, because if it does muck up halfway down, you're not going to break any machines and you're not going to denial of service any of users. And this is really important on a desktop. It's even more important on a terminal server where you've got hundreds of users on a terminal server. The other part of this that we don't show on this, unfortunately, is on a terminal server, because your application might need to reboot the server. So, for example, if you're installing Office, you may need to reboot the server. You at least, even if you're not going to reboot, you still need to get all the users off the server before you can install and update the application. With SoftGrid, when you have it on a terminal server, the additional advantages you get over this model, which is the model on the desktop, is one, you never have to reboot the server. Two, you don't have to log off any of the users. So suddenly you can move and distribute applications among your terminal servers and desktops without having to log users off and without having to reboot. Again, that's extremely powerful in terms of time to deploy applications and sort of headaches that you have to think about as you're deploying. And for those of you that are IT managers or have IT managers, that does help reduce costs. Now, some people are sometimes nervous. That might mean that they have less of a job to do. But the key is if you're spending less time packaging and troubleshooting, which quite frankly is a tedious process, you can spend more time doing the interesting things. And you can also build business continuity. And the way that you do this is suddenly your workstations aren't specific to users. So a user can move from one workstation to another workstation, and their apps can roam and follow them with streaming. Obviously, you need the network bandwidth for the streaming to happen. But if a data site fails and there's a backup site, all the users need to do is move to the backup site. As long as your data center is still intact, the place where you've stored the SoftGrid apps, they'll sit down at the machine. It won't have any of their apps on it. And within the time it takes to stream the application, and that varies because they're going to use network bandwidth, they'll get the applications up without you having to worry about, do the apps work, do they conflict, what's the build on that desktop, did I have the latest service pack on it? Again, makes things a lot easier. And it'll also result, for those of you that perhaps help with your help desk calls, it will reduce the number of help desk calls. Makes it easier as well. If you've got something where you've identified there's an application problem, you no longer have to sit with the user and work out, is it the instance of the application? Just delete them and make sure they've got the latest version of the application. And suddenly, centrally and quickly, you can give a person the most up-to-date version of the application and spend less time on the phone with them. And this allows you to have fewer golden masters in terms of imaging, because now you need less applications in the image, because it's easier to distribute the applications. You have less images, and they stay stable. In terms of terminal servers, we have some additional benefits that SoftGrid brings to terminal servers. All the other benefits you get on SoftGrid for the desktop and SoftGrid for TS. These are the ones that are now unique to SoftGrid for terminal services. So today, many of you may have terminal services farms where you've got one farm for application A, one farm for application B. And the problem with that is you end up with a lot of spare capacity, because you need spare capacity in each farm. The reason you're probably doing this, if you are doing it, is you'll find that application A doesn't work with application B, so you create these silos, these TS farms. Because you can use SoftGrid to now deploy the application to the terminal server and run it side by side, because we don't have the app-to-app conflicts, you can suddenly get rid of all of your silos that are being caused by application conflicts within your terminal server farms. Russell Investments, who is one of our case study customers, they did this, and they reduced the number of terminal servers that they had by 40%. Now, normally with these marketing case studies, we always put the best number up there. Of course we would. Actually, this is a typical number. I'm seeing multiple customers that I'm talking to that are getting numbers in this range when they've got very large farms, especially farms that might be sort of 3-4 years old. So that can make it a lot easier to manage the terminal server. And that's even before you think about the benefits of installing applications on the terminal server. And I have a pretty graphic to explain applications don't work. I should have brought that up. The other one is the terminal server profiles. So as we established earlier, some of you do have problems with profiles. What SoftGrid does, or what SoftGrid can do, is it can allow you to take the user state associated with the application. So that's the data for the application, the HKey HKey current user hive for the application, along with the HKLM hive for the application, and allows you to store the writes that would normally happen in a custom area. So what this means is, even if you're using a roaming profile, you can take SoftGrid and configure it in such a way that on an application by application basis, rather than storing the data in the profile, you store it off on a network location. What that suddenly does is it suddenly means applications aren't holding the registry or the profile open, which is one of the causes of profile corruption. So that's one benefit. Suddenly, your profile data on a per application basis isn't stored in the profile, it's stored somewhere else, so the profile's smaller. That makes it quicker to sync at logon. So logon times can be quite a problem for some terminal server customers. Now the profile's smaller, logon's quicker. So SoftGrid brings real concrete benefits to the terminals. I put my clicker. Brings real benefits to the terminal server platform in terms of making it more reliable. I think that's really key. And it makes roaming profiles effective. Lots of people don't use roaming profiles with TS because they have so many problems. This again makes it a reality, makes it practical to use. With SoftGrid 4.2, we have a complete streaming platform. We also have SoftGrid 4.5, which was announced in the keynote. You can go to Connect. I don't know if you know connect.microsoft.com, but any of you can go there and set up a Connect account and download the SoftGrid bits. We have a new SoftGrid 4.5 beta for terminal services. We have some more of that to go up in the next couple of days, but you'll be able to play with that. But the real key here is that SoftGrid really is a platform for Microsoft. It's something we're investing heavily in, and we see it really key to managing both Windows desktops and Windows servers. So at this point, I'd like to invite Jason up to do a demonstration of SoftGrid and SoftGrid for TS and show you some of the things that we've been talking about. Thank you, Jason.
Alex, I know I can't hear myself, so is he even on? Test?
There we go.
Okay, now I can hear myself. Well, thank you very much. So hopefully, I think Alex has done a great job talking about the new features of terminal services, as well as how to position SoftGrid and how they can work together. So I wanted to kind of show you. How many of you have actually seen SoftGrid in action? A few of you. Okay. But not too many, so hopefully this will be a new demo for you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to start out with the Windows client. Excellent. Yeah, I've been working with terminal services for almost 10 years now. It's just amazing how far things have come. It's really exciting to see this stuff. So right now, I'm logged on to a Windows Vista machine, and I want to point out a couple things to you. I've got a domain controller here running SoftGrid, and I've got a Terminal Server 2003 machine running in a virtual machine. So from a performance perspective, just to give you a little bit of context. So when I log on, I have roaming user profiles enabled. I have folder redirection enabled as well. And then I also have my applications, all of my applications streamed through SoftGrid. The benefit of doing this is that I can log on anywhere within my organization of 2 machines and a terminal server, and I will have my same desktop. Actually, the desktop I don't have redirected for terminal services, but I will have my data as well as my applications. And so you can see here, when I log on, I'll show you that if I go into my program files folder, I don't have Office installed here at all. However, in SoftGrid, I have it set up so that I should have this available to me. So I actually have my full suite of Office 2007, as well as one application for Excel 2003 on my machine. And all these are given to me via SoftGrid. So for example, I can open up this application here, and you'll see down at the bottom it says starting launch, and it's got 100% of what it needs to run, so it'll bring that up. As Alex mentioned, it'll stream down to my local machine enough necessary to actually start up Excel, and this is done through the sequencing of the packaging of the application. And then as I need more features, as I use them, it'll stream them down. Of course, I can go into a management tool, a client management tool, and actually force it to pull everything down. If I'm on a laptop, I'm not connecting to the network, I can pull down everything into my cache. So for this case, there's a few things I want to do. I'm almost done with my budget, so I'll have my total here. Copy that across, and I'm going to make this all in red. Sorry for having the dollar signs there. Those should be in euros. And I'll convert that, and then one more thing that I want to do is I actually want to kind of add a couple additional bars maybe onto the side. There are some custom settings. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this. I'm going to exit out. And then you'll notice here that it says Excel is shutting down. So just some messages from the SoftGrid. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to log into my terminal server application. And again, because I'm logging in with the same user ID, I've got the same policies, group policy to do my folder redirection. SoftGrid actually deploys its applications or targets the applications based on group assignment within Active Directory. So I log in here, and you'll see that I've got my applications on the desktop. I can take a look at my program files here. Here's my copy of Excel. Here's my copy of Office 2007. Oops. And so now when I launch into this application, again, because I'm using the SoftGrid for terminal services client, it's streamed to the terminal service connection, and I've got my, my red thing here. The one thing that didn't come across was my little system bar, but I think I logged off too quickly for that. So just to kind of show, if I can switch over to my server here, I'll show you kind of how we actually set some stuff up. And sure enough, I'm going to be confused by this. Hold on one second. Unfortunately, I don't have the video out, so this is number 3. Is it on there now?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll close this out. Basically, as the administrator on the machine, I've got my SoftGrid management console. This takes a couple seconds to load. And again, all I've done was I've added this user object to a few different groups, Excel 2003 and Office 2007. So this takes a couple seconds for the SoftGrid application to start up. So bear with me for a quick second. Sometimes it takes a little longer than usual. Here we go. So I've sequenced a whole bunch of different versions of Office here. And as you can see, I can actually go in and enable, I'll click on one first and show you that within the suite, here's the individual applications. I can go in and I can actually enable the entire suite if I wanted to, or I can enable just a specific application. So here, because this is Office 2003, we've already completed our migration. A few folks still require an older version of Excel because of some macros. So you can see that the suite, the enabled checkbox is slightly gray. That means it's not completely there. If I go into the specific application itself, so you can see how granular this is. I've actually enabled Excel 2003. I can identify where to actually put the icons on the desktop, the quick launch, the start menu. I can give it the name of the start menu. And then here I've actually assigned anyone that's in the Office 2003 group. If I've enabled this application, those people should get it. And then with Office 2007, I've actually enabled the entire suite. And again, here's the folder that it should go into off of the start menu. And again, anyone in the Office 2007 group should get it. So it's a relatively simple process to be able to dynamically go in and change stuff around very easily. And so because the TS client is very similar to the standard Windows desktop client, the user experience is the same. I'm configuring the applications and assigning the applications the exact same way. So whether I'm logging on to my desktop, a mobile PC, or the terminal server environment, it's exactly the same for both the end user as well as the administrator. Thank you. What did you lose?
Oh, well. I put down the
clicker.
yeah, I'd lose anything if it wasn't attached. Tell you. So you know, Jason really highlighted there is the putting it all together piece, which is wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I get the same applications delivered to the user without me as the administrator having to think about anything more than is the SoftGrid client on that endpoint, be it the terminal server, be it a desktop, being it a laptop that the user has. So suddenly you just say, Bob wants an application. You don't need to worry, does machine XYZ have that application? The system dynamically does that for you and effectively turns applications into a dynamic form of data that can transform the way you administer your system. Now, that sounds great. Some of you still might be going, but how do I pick between SoftGrid and terminal services? So I said I promised we would address this. So really, it's the wrong question. The right question is, the right way to think about it is, where do I want an application? It's the same decision we've always had with terminal services. Do I want to run the application on my local machine and have it execute on my local machine with all the benefits that that gives me? Or do I want to put the application on a terminal server and have the application running there because it gives me the benefits I get on a terminal server? The bandwidth issues. And really, once you've made that decision, your decision is now, do I want to manage the application lifecycle, whether it's a desktop or a terminal server, with SoftGrid? And that's really the right way to think about it. You decide where you want your application to run for all of the reasons we highlighted at the beginning, whether it's, and for some of these that are on here. So let's look at these in more detail. So for example, terminal services is great at delivering applications over low bandwidth, where you don't want the application local because it's a chatty client-server application. However, you probably want to use, in a scenario that's a high network, you're probably going to use a desktop. You might use terminal server because you have unique security needs. And of course, if the bandwidth's none, i.e. you want to go offline, there's no way you can use a terminal server for that scenario. In terms of data security, you have a centralized model with a terminal server. So we talked about some of the ways that you could centralize and get a security benefit around compliance. And with desktops, it's a decentralized model. That doesn't mean to say one is better than the other or more or less secure than the other. They're different. They have different management needs. In terms of the device, terminal services can ensure that your Windows application is accessible on a Mac device, a Linux device, a thin client, a Windows device. If you're using SoftGrid, you're interested in delivering SoftGrid for desktops, you're interested in delivering the application to a Windows desktop. And then lastly, there's the type of application type. We'd never pretend that all applications are ideal to go on a terminal server. Anything that's graphics intensive, multimedia, processor intensive isn't really an ideal candidate for terminal services. It's an ideal candidate for a desktop machine. And what I hope you're going to take away from this is that you should be making the decision to use terminal services based on the things that terminal services is good at. You should be making the choice to use the desktop on the things that the desktop is good at. Some of you may be struggling with desktop management, so you may think about terminal services or VDI type scenarios in the hope that pushing the application somewhere else makes them easy to manage. I'd maintain it doesn't. If you have a management problem today on your desktop, it's unlikely you're going to have well-managed terminal servers, and it's unlikely that you're going to have well-managed VDI implementation. But something like SoftGrid can help you make your implementation well-managed and can save you a lot of time, a lot of work, and a lot of hassle, and make the user experience much, much better so you get less help desk calls and less complaints. And so if you're struggling with that application management, keeping the OS stable as you take apps on and take off, personally, I think SoftGrid's essential and can't be lived without. I think it is that important to managing applications on the Windows platform. So hopefully you understand that SoftGrid and TS are entirely complementary technologies. That SoftGrid doesn't replace terminal services in any way. That SoftGrid is about managing application lifecycle. How do I deploy the app? How do I retire the app? And about helping you keep your system more stable and more productive. We have a whole bunch of related content. I'll let you look at this. You can download the slides. Again, if you're really interested in more on the TS, I recommend the 2 Chalk and Talks on Wednesday and Friday. If you want to come and ask us questions, we'll be there. I have some links if you want to try some of the labs and download some of the collateral. The key one here I'd draw your eye to is the TS blog. So if you're interested in more on terminal services, please look at the TS blog. We have really detailed technical information up there that I think you'll find very interesting and very compelling. And so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to some Q&A. I think we've got 10 minutes. We have microphones, or do I need to? I'll repeat. Licensing. Yes. So what's your question on licensing? I didn't see who it was. Oh, okay, yes. So the question was, so with Office, and we'll deal with Office because if it's another vendor's application, you need to ask them. So with Office, if you're using SoftGrid or terminal services and you're sending applications to somewhere that hasn't normally got Office on, how do you license? Our licensing for Office is quite clear. You need to license every device that does or can access Office. So if you know that that machine has the potential to use Office, you should really license it. If you can guarantee that a machine doesn't use Office, you don't need to license it. You don't really need to buy the license until that machine's accessed Office for the first time, but licenses are permanently assigned. So once you've purchased the license and permanently assigned it to a device, you can't retire that license from that device until the device is retired. People ask us, so what's a reasonable time frame for doing that? And I think our licensing policies say you can do that after 90 days, once you know the device isn't coming back. To be clear, that doesn't mean you can use the licensing terms to affect concurrent licensing for Office. We do not have concurrent licensing. We have an assigned device model for Office licensing. So I want to be clear on that. We have a licensing white paper on www.microsoft.com/ts. I think it's the second or third link down on the page, which talks about Microsoft application licensing in the terminal service scenario. Do we have one for SoftGrid yet, do you know, in terms of a white paper? Okay, I don't know if we've got one explicitly for SoftGrid. Can you migrate the current TS-Cal licenses of 2003 to 2008? If you're a software assurance customer, yes. If you're not a software assurance customer, no. So you will need new Windows 2008 TS-Cals, just like you'll need new Windows 2008 Cals to access a 2008 server. Cal upgrade is one of the advantages of software assurance for your Cals. If you're renewing now, before Windows Server 2008 comes out, I'd strongly advise you to investigate getting software assurance if you're renewing. I think it could save you a lot of money. Any more questions?
Hello. What's the performance impact for SoftGrid?
The performance impact of SoftGrid in general, in terms of how much impact it has running on an application, on a machine.
Yeah, let's say a gaming client.
I think it's fairly minor, but I mean, I heard one, last time I checked on this, I think I was given a number of 1 or 2%, but I don't know if that's real.
Yeah, I think that the performance is as it's pulling down as it's streaming the application down from the SoftGrid server to the local machine. And again, you can cache all of it so that it's always running locally. At that point, it's local execution, so the performance should not be noticeable.
It really is quite a lightweight intercept, the SoftGrid process.
What can you tell us about performance benefits with 64-bit?
What can I tell you?
TS?
64-bit for TS.
And specifically, is there 64-bit support if you're using SoftGrid with TS?
Mumble, mumble, mumble. Okay, so I'll deal with the first question there. The first question is, well, so 64-bit allows you to do, 64-bit isn't inherently faster than 32-bit. What it allows you to do is use more memory. So what this means is on a terminal server, traditionally in the 32-bit world, we were usually memory limited. You're either limited by the amount of memory you could use for the user, or more seriously, you were limited by something called PTEs, which was page table entry. So sometimes you'd have memory reported free and get out of memory errors. And this kind of led to the rule of thumb that said for a terminal server, it's 50 users on 2 processors with 4 gig of RAM. And that's kind of the rule of thumb people have in their heads. With 64-bit, that rule goes out of the window. We've shown pretty good scaling up to, I think, 8 cores, 16 cores. You obviously need to load up with the memory for that, but there's now no scaling barrier to a single machine for a terminal server in terms of how much resource you can throw at a problem. Obviously, that means you probably want to optimize for dollar per user. So, look at the boxes that you can buy, work out how many users you're going to get on that box from a capacity planning perspective, and then give yourself the calculation of dollar per user and pick the box that's going to give you the best return on investment. You no longer need to worry about constraints from an actual architectural perspective.
And to answer the question about SoftGrid, at this time, no, there is no 64-bit support.
Yeah, and we have nothing to announce as to when there might be 64-bit support. So yeah, if you want to use SoftGrid for TS on Windows Server 2008, you are going to need 32-bit Windows Server 2008 terminal servers.
Okay.
I think this gentleman in the front row had a question.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
The rule of thumb.
Right. You mentioned the rule of thumb.
Oh, so that rule of thumb, to be quite clear, that rule of thumb is complete utter garbage. And the reason that's complete utter garbage is, you know, one user might be editing in Notepad, and one user might be doing the most complex Excel and Access you could possibly imagine. So there is no rule of thumb. People want Microsoft to come out and say, you can get X number of users on this type of terminal server. Any number we give you is going to be wrong compared to your implementation, because your implementation is unique. You know, somebody over here, their implementation is unique. The only way to really understand how many users you're going to get in your environment is to test your apps, your users on your server, and get a ratio of what's good for your business. Again, people have different sensitivity to how much responsiveness they want for a user. So for some customers, even if it was an identical set of users with an identical set of applications, one customer might say performance is fine, another might say it's not. So there's a very subjective piece here, and that's why we have capacity planning white papers more than we ever say a number of users. The one thing I will say is the number you see in our white papers appears very high compared to the real world. And that's because it's an artificial synthetic benchmark. It isn't designed to mimic real users. It's designed to stress the system in a way that we can compare different editions of terminal services. So you shouldn't take what you see in our capacity planning white paper as any indication of the number of users that you want. I know that isn't the story that a lot of people want to hear, but it's the truthful story in that it's the only one that's going to give you good guidance. Now, for some customers, I have seen them choose to overestimate or underestimate the number of users per box, because for some projects, buying more hardware can, this is strange, but buying more hardware can be cheaper than doing the testing. So you need to work that out for your organization. My personal preference is the empirical approach. Get a pilot, get some real users on it with the real apps, see how they do, and once you've monitored them for 3 months, you'll know what do the log-on periods look like. How do I cope with peak demand? Because very one thing having a synthetic test that isn't peak demand, linear demand, but peak demand at log-on is a real big issue. That's another reason why it's so hard to estimate number of users. So, you know, do your own testing. It really is key. I went on the next one.
That's me.
Oh.
Talking about streaming to the terminal server, to a desktop, and to a mobile PC. If I do an Office suite with SoftGrid and I put it on a notebook and I disconnect from the network, is it still there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And the policy or group policies manage which kind of users get the application.
So to be clear, so there's a local cache that when you stream down, it copies down into a special area of the hard drive, and you can set what that size is. So yes, you can force it to load down 100% of it, so that as a mobile user, I've got all the features all the time. Group policy is not involved. What's happening is I put users into groups within Active Directory. And then within the admin console, which I showed you, I actually enabled an application, meaning it's available to the user community. Those users happen to be, that are in that group that are associated with the app gets it then. So
yeah, I understand that, but it might be possible that a notebook is not used by only one guy, maybe by 2 or 3. Yeah. So one gets the whole bunch of the Office suite, the other one gets Word, the next one gets whatever. So if it's offline and group policy is not in fact working on that, do they get everything, or is it cached also locally?
The cache is global to the system, but if I don't have permissions to Word, I don't see Word if I log on to that machine.
Even if you're offline?
Yes,
okay.
It's controlled by groups, not by group policy, which begs the question, if they're offline, how are they going to log on, because it's not going to be able to do the group query. So yeah, if you logged on as a local user, you're not going to have permission to any of the SoftGrid apps. You need to log in with that domain account because we're going to go and query the groups.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I didn't talk about the local user of the notebook, but if I have 2 or 3 users, domain users.
It's associated with the user SID though. So if I personally don't have access to that file because I'm not in the group, it's not exposed to me in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the question is, what about the user that's not allowed? I don't see anything. The icons don't appear on my desktop. The cache area is not something that's exposed to the user. It's exposed to the SoftGrid client itself. So it's just like it's not there. Correct. So if you had a Word document, that Word document wouldn't be associated with anything at that point.
Guy with the stripy shirt.
Yeah. So the question is, streaming applications, can they communicate to each other? They can share Windows services. They can cut and paste. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they are independent applications like you would expect them to function.
So I think we recommend that you do that, but here you saw us using a package between a terminal server and a Vista machine. They're fundamentally very different operating systems. So we're not going to say that there aren't application compatibility issues that might be caused by OS to OS differences. So to give you an example, if you install something and you sequence it on Vista, and their application makes a decision at install time that says, oh, I'm not going to install my own search service because I see Vista's got a search service and I'm going to integrate with it. If you then move that application to a Windows 2003 terminal server, then you're kind of screwed at that point because it hasn't got the Vista search service. So there are some black magic there in terms of thinking that through. But in terms of an application, if the application doesn't make any assumptions about the OS, you'll be pretty safe. And as you see, we saw Office, you can do Adobe Acrobat Reader. There's always edge cases, but the vast majority of apps seem to move reasonably well.
The best practice is to test. My understanding from the SoftGrid team is that you're going to be able to get away with more on this as opposed to standard MSI repackaging. But again, you always want to just test it, which is a best practice anyways.
Okay, so I think we have flashing lights, which I think means we have to finish. Obviously, if you've got more questions, feel free to come up and we'll answer them as we pack up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.